Where are you talking to us from today?
Oh, the excitingly named Normal, Illinois.
Normal, Illinois. Okay.
Yes,
Must have
yes,
been a normal school there or something.
there was, and it became Illinois State University.
Huh.
And there's
That's where you
actually
that's
there's
where
a
you've
Normal
been.
Avenue in Normal,
There's a what avenue? Sorry.
Normal Avenue. So when we first moved here, our daughter, who was almost high school age, was insisting that we had to live on Normal Avenue so she could be normal in Normal.
Oh my gosh. Well, I
Yes.
mean, somebody has 420 High Street in Denver. So uh,
Okay.
so Professor Tim Hunt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your own professional background, and what led to your professional interest in Robinson Jeffers?
Probably redneck stubbornness.
Okay.
Okay. So I grew up in Northern California and disliked poetry quite intensively, or intensely rather. And we had a teacher who mother had run a boarding house in Monterey. And one day he mentioned casually that he thought Jeffers might be the great 20th century American poet rather than Frost. And I remembered that, and I was hanging out in the little Carnegie Town Library, and there were Jeffers books up there, and I picked the thinnest one, which was The Beginning and the End, and I thumbed through, and I found the shortest poem, which is called Hand, and I read that, and I thought, uh-oh, this is something entirely different than I'd been told poetry was.
Hmm.
So that's how I started reading Jeffers. I was probably 15 or 16.
Pretty young.
And when I went off to start college at what I thought was Ithaca, New York, but turned out to be Ithaca, um, I assumed that people in the English department would value Jeffers. And of course, then I was told that no, he wasn't of interest and he was worthless and I shouldn't read him. And that's where I became stubborn. And I thought, well, I need to figure out whether there's something wrong with their response or there's something wrong with mine. And so, trying to study American literature and American poetry, and especially 20th century American poetry, part of what I was always interested in was in what way does Jeffers contest the field? In what way does the whole process of 20th century American poetry become richer to us if we incorporate him in the canon rather than exclude him?
Mm-hmm.
So, I eventually made my peace with Ezra Pound. I don't know that I've ever fully made my peace with T.S. Eliot, but you have to be able to play more than one game if you want to talk across the boundaries and the margins. So that's where the professional interest gradually emerged from. Let's see, and you then wanted me to talk about.
If you could just give a quick intro, who is Robinson Jeffers?
Oh,
How would you
sure.
introduce him on, as I said, like standing on one foot for someone who hasn't heard of
Sure.
him before?
Jeffers was a very near contemporary of Pound and Eliot, Wallace Stevens, so that era of American poetry. And in the 1920s, he was regarded as one of the preeminent American poets. Over the 1940s and 1950s, his reputation went into eclipse, and it has gradually come back somewhat through the interest of people in environmental literature in particular. But some of the underlying issues that led to him being marginalized initially have never really been fully addressed and redressed. And to my mind, what's crucial there is that Jeffers is in a kind of conflicted relationship with the poetics of the so-called new criticism, which emerges out of Eliot's ideas about poetry. And when the new critics essentially introduced American poetry into the American college curriculum in the late 40s and the early 1950s, they decided who would be taught, they decided who would be in the anthologies, and that did not include Jeffers. And it was partly because of the long narratives. It was partly because of the long rhythmic lines, a whole variety of reasons. But that's part of what we've never fully confronted, those of us who value Jeffers' work, which is his connection to, rather than simply his marginality from, the rest of American poetry. So,
and I feel like something that we were going to get into today as part of that too, a little bit of, I think, a snobbish attitude that poetry should not be in a language that is too normal, and his language can be very normal seeming.
Yes, or as I've sometimes told my students when I was still teaching, Pound is hard to read but easy to understand once you figure out the surface. Jeffers is easy to read on the surface, and good luck, you'll get lost in what's underneath the surface because it is rich and complex and dynamic. So there, in a sense, the complexity is there, but it's in an alternate form. The complexity in Pound is often linguistic. The complexity in Jeffers is often situational.
That's really well put. You know, as an analogy to that, occurred to me the other day. I was the last few days, I was in northern Colorado camping, and at a favorite spot, and there was this faraway mountain that I had always kind of admired from the spot, and I thought, you know, oh, that's a really cool peak. It's just part of kind of my mental background to the place. And this time, having been there for 35 years, I finally used one of those apps to find out what it was. And it turned out it was Long's Peak, which you can see from so many places in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. And I had never realized it was this one mountain I'd been seeing forever, just from a different angle. And I think sometimes, you know, I mentioned to you before we started the conversation here that I read at least Jeffers' long narrative Cador at least twice a year, and I have since 2012. Every time that I read it, there's something where I say, oh, right, like that's what that means, or that's who this is in reference to, or something like that. It continually astonishes me sometimes. Honestly, I think a little bit of that, a possible parallel to that is maybe the New Testament, which on the surface, if you don't read it in a kind of obfuscating, archaizing translation, can be very plain in language and parable, but can conceal a lot of complexity of message within the various parables and such.
Right. Well, and I think with Jeffers too, there's a sense that he often let his literary learning or his literary knowledge be implicit rather than to foreground it. And there's a late poem, Granddaughter, which was published after he died. And it seems to be simply a little portrait of his granddaughter, occasioned by seeing a painting of her at the age of, I think, 2. And it's like, oh, that's nice. You look carefully at the rhetoric of it, it's a rewrite of Browning's My Last Duchess.
That makes sense. That had not occurred to me, but it makes sense.
But it's pivoted against it in an interesting way. And then similarly, there's a moment in the middle of the poem where he talks about modern fudging in painting. So unlike the accurate portrait, the current style is to make the painter's eccentricity come to the fore. Well, that's implicitly a dig at modernist aesthetics. So the poem is, on the one hand, simply a celebration of the granddaughter. On the other, it's a bit of literary dialogue. And on the other, it's a contesting of poetics. And all of that weaves together in a way that as you read it, you don't have to notice any of that to experience the poem.
Right. And on top of that, contesting of poetics with an eye on the future implicitly,
Right.
because he's talking about his granddaughter at the end of his life.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there's so much folded in to so much of this work. But let's come right back to this. There's a great question here to get mentioned right at the start. Andrea asks, if you've never read any Jeffers, what books or poems are the best to read? What would you recommend?
Probably start with a selected. And let's see. Start with some of the ones that are anthologized when he's anthologized at all. And those would include poems like Hurt Hawks, Salmon Fishing, Purse Seine, Vulture. I'm kind of going across kind of a bit of a chronological span there. And I would start with some of those rather than with the narratives, because initially when you look at the narratives, it can seem that essentially they're prose arbitrarily broken into lines, which from all of your time working with Cawdor, is not the case. Right. But it's probably more useful to get a bit of a feel for how the poems work in some of the shorter pieces before you jump into one of the narratives. And a good one to start with there might be something like Roan Stallion.
Roan Stallion is a good choice. Another short poem I would point out is Shine, Perishing Republic.
Yes.
Pretty well known, pretty often anthologized here, there, and yon, or quoted here, there, and yon. Right. And as far as the narrative,
I was going to say, and the other thing is, I can't see Andrea because she's a black screen on my, but she's welcome to send me an email, and I can try to suggest some things for her based on her interests.
Cool. And I'd point out that someone interested in Norse studies might be curious to see the poem At the Birth of an Age.
Yes.
Which is I think it's in the old selected, which I have right here. Yeah, it is. This is the 1930s selected poetry. You were talking about the 2000. Yeah, you were talking about the 2002.
Right. Yeah.
But which I don't think it's in.
I don't remember. It's been a long time since I looked at that table of contents. It might not be.
But
in which case, you're going to take me out behind the woodshed and wail on me, aren't you?
Hey, I forget about what's in my books. So, anyway, yeah, that would be something to point out, because he draws on the Saga of the Volsungs and on Odin's self-sacrifice in Havamal in that poem.
Right.
And I think when you and I first met was actually when I did a paper at the RJA conference about that poem.
Yes.
Because I couldn't figure out if he had read it in translation or in the original. It's really hard to figure out where he was getting it, because for all I can tell, and having looked over his library, he might have read the original somewhere. He quotes the names in a form that don't appear in a translation, but which you can get out of the Old Norse. So anyway, he's a fascinating person. I mean, he knew a lot of languages. So it's not
definitely
impossible.
He knew German very well. How familiar he was with Old Norse, I don't know. But one thing that might interest you in terms of that, the collection that's in, Solstice, he originally thought about publishing it, it was to be titled Attila's Wife.
Huh.
And it wasn't to include Solstice. So then he writes Solstice, and then he adds that into the collection.
Interesting. I think At the Birth of an Age is a better poem.
Yes.
if I have to be a jerk to my own favorite poet. So Attila's Wife, that's what should have been.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And that's in your collected poetry volume. Is it 2?
That would be in volume. The poem itself would be in volume 2.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah.
I have that back in Colorado.
Right.
Well, let's take a look at some of these poems that we talked about beforehand. Do you want to share screen maybe, or do you want me to?
I'm not as adept at this as you are. So maybe you could share the screen. Would that be okay?
Sure. No problem. I'll just pull this up in my email.
What do you want to start with?
Oh, well, actually, it's not in the order that you've got them here. There's Granddaughter, which you mentioned earlier. Why don't we do that because you just mentioned it?
Sure.
Would you like to read it? I'd be interested to hear your reading.
Okay. And here's a portrait of my granddaughter Una when she was 2 years old. A remarkable painter, a perfect likeness, nothing tricky nor modernist, nothing of the artist fudging his art into the picture, but simple and true. She stands in a glade of trees with a still inlet of blue ocean behind her. Thus exactly she looked then, a forgotten flower in her hand, those great blue eyes, asking and wondering. Now she is 5 years old and found herself. She does not ask anymore, but commands, sweet and fierce-tempered. That light red hair of hers is the fuse for explosions. When she is 18, I'll not be here. I hope she will find her natural elements, laughter and violence, and in her quiet times, the beauty of things, the beauty of transhuman things without which we are all lost. I hope she will find powerful protection and a man like a hawk to cover her.
You read extremely beautifully rhythmically, I think. You actually remind me a little bit of the few recordings you can hear of him on Recorder Obscura on YouTube.
Right. Well, if you look at his manuscripts, most of the poems are not revised heavily from their original draft. But where they are revised, they're often in terms of honing the phrasing for rhythmic effect. So he was very aware of the cadence of the language, which I think comes back to a family story. His work area was in the attic of Tor House, and that ran the whole length of the house over the living room and whatnot. And when he was writing, he would pace back and forth, framing a passage or a poem in his head, and then sit down and write it out in pencil. And Una, his wife, could hear him pacing, and if he sat for too long, she knew he wasn't working. And she'd take a broom and she'd pound the floor under his feet, saying, "Pace, Robin, pace," to get him back up and moving on the next passage. And in the narratives, if you look at the way the manuscripts unfold, you can tell where he stops to write down a sequence, and then the next sequence. So I do think that sense of pacing of the spoken language as having cadence, as opposed to the written language, which has a different kind of spatial relationship, is very much a part of his poetic.
And how would you describe if you think this is an appropriate word to use, which I guess I shouldn't beg the question, how would you describe the meter here?
Well, he was very adamant that it wasn't free verse, even though sometimes he's considered to be writing free verse because he's not writing in iambics or a measurable foot. But typically his lines have a certain shared number of cadences, and that's a pattern. So it might be a 4-cadence line or a 4-beat line or a 3-beat line, or the poem might move for a line of 4 or 5 beats to 3 beats back and forth. And he talks about that coming to some degree out of his immersion in Old English. So he didn't count syllables, he counted stresses.
Right. I think that's actually an extremely important and interesting and kind of subtle similarity of his work with Old English and Old Norse poetry, is that stress counting, which is actually common to a lot of older Indo-European languages, and to some extent you can see in the Hebrew of the Old Testament. As I recall, not a big Hebrew scholar, but here, for example, I count 4 stresses to the line. no particular, as you said, no, it's not iambic or trochaic exactly, but it does have a certain count that you can anticipate kind of when the next line is going to come.
Right. Yeah. And often in the narratives, there's some interesting passages, for instance, in The Loving Shepherdess, where it'll be 4-beat, 3-beat, 4-beat, 3-beat. And the way he varies the length of the phrases within that pattern is probably somewhat improvisational in the act of composing, but very well controlled for effect. So again, there's a level of artistry that the traditional new critical approach would just miss. I mean, the usual understanding is that it's not worth bothering to read Jeffers closely, when in fact the opposite is quite the case. If you flip us to Rearmament, there's a good instance of why that's the case there.
Is that in this?
Yeah, if we go back
it's back
a little bit.
Oh, you've got this roughly in chronological.
Yeah. And some people may know the phrase "dark mountain" from the environmental movement, which takes this poem as sort of its motto. But starting, first off, it's a sonnet, which is not immediately obvious, or it's organized rhetorically as a sonnet. If you look at the fifth line, it is beautiful as a river flowing or slowly gathering, glacier on a high mountain rock face, bound to plow down a forest, or as frost in November, the gold and flaming death dance for leaves, or a girl in the night of her spent maidenhood, bleeding and kissing. I would burn my right hand in a slow fire. Well, the thing here, we were talking earlier about the situational in the poem. And in fact, what he's trying to respond to here is his perception in the mid-1930s that as Europe rearms, we were moving inevitably toward a cataclysmic Second World War. And he starts off as if he is sort of aloof from it. And it only becomes clear as you move through the poem that he's in fact terribly agonized over it. And the sequence of details that we just looked at gives you an example of, or an instance of why. These instances of, in a sense, natural world or natural beauty, as he would see them, are the exact opposite of what they should be if he were simply aloof and able to respond to these things without anguish and pain. As it stands, they move from the most, the instance which is most extremely beyond human time to right within human time. If we were transcending, it should be the opposite order. Mm-hmm. But it's not random, right? We go general, more specific, most specific, broadest sense of time, progressively lesser sense of time, immediacy. And it's that move to immediacy that drives the sort of exclamation, I would burn my right hand in a slow fire.
Mm-hmm. Which is so, not only so personal, but so just agonizingly specific. It's not, it's not the way people talk about, I'd give my left foot. I mean, it's right. An extremely painful image. And of course, he's thinking about his sons.
Right. Yeah. So there again, there's a sense of control. And I don't mean necessarily deliberation, I'll move in exactly this pattern, but the poem enacts a pattern that is certainly not accidental. Mm-hmm. And so then we have the threat of violence intensified through the images, the emotional reaction, and then some degree of recovery in the last couple of lines. The beauty of modern man is not in the persons, but in the disastrous rhythm, the heavy and mobile masses, the dance of the dream-led masses down the dark mountain. But that moment of somewhat acceptance only becomes compelling emotionally and aesthetically against the not the suffering, the struggle of the dramatized I to make sense of it. So we often have in Jeffers a sense that, oh, we're just listening to this guy talk. But usually, if we look carefully, the I is a dramatic figure, and the claims that seem most didactic or most summary are, in fact, functioning as dramatic moments within the way the poem unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most, I mean, glaring or clearest examples of that would be something like Hurt Hawks, where the line that's often quoted out of context, "I would sooner kill a man than a hawk."
Right.
Or I'd sooner accept the penalties, kill a man than a hawk. But that functions dramatically within the poem. And if we don't see it as a dramatic moment of that I, then we miss the whole impact of the poem.
Well, his pity for two specific hawks.
Right.
I mean, it's sometimes lines like that are quoted in these dismissals of Jeffers as being, somehow truly anti-human, right? Misanthropic being a word that comes up so often. I don't read him as a just blanket misanthrope.
No.
But as someone who's capable of intense sympathy with non-human beings,
right.
Particularly in his case, birds of prey.
Well, and in this case, we can also bring Cawdor into the mix.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With the dying eagle's dream.
Well,
which is...
yeah. So Hurt Hawks appears in the Cawdor volume.
Oh, well, yeah, right.
Okay, but originally, when he first finished The Women at Point Sur and was working with Liveright to get it published, there were to be 6 short poems that would follow the long narrative. And one of them was to be a poem called The Hurt Hawk. If you look at the dates of things, it's not absolutely, take it to court and prove it, but it's highly likely that part 1 of Hurt Hawks is originally the poem called The Hurt Hawk. Mm-hmm. So he writes the first part of the poem before he actually kills the hawk. He writes the second part of the poem some months later after he kills the hawk. And at that point, they've left the short poems out of Point Sur because of the length of the narrative. And so it gets carried over into the Cawdor volume.
I see. I mean, this is part of what's so fascinating about talking to you about these things, because you have such a personal view from having seen, well, and not only the notebooks these originally came from, but having chronologized it. I originally
this anticipates, this anticipates the caged eagle's death dream, right? So this explains some of not explains, but it links to the intensity of that lyric moment within that narrative. And then within the construction of the Cawdor volume, because it comes toward the end, it functions as a kind of coda to that dream. But in fact, it helps initiate it, and then it's played as a comment on it.
Right. Well, I mean, you could even sort of picture this as George Cawdor's side of the story and the caged eagle's death dream. Although the story is a little bit different, although not too different. Yeah. I originally read this as one hawk in both parts.
It is.
Then I feel like then for a few years I came to think of it as 2.
Right.
And now I'm hearing you talk about it as 1 again, and I'm like, maybe I was right in the beginning.
I think you were, and I think the second hawk is himself. He is the second Hurt Hawk. So here's his dilemma in the poem. He knows that the hawk is suffering, but to put it out of its misery is to impose a kind of sentimental human perspective on nature that nature has that nature doesn't take into account. He should simply stand aside, but he can't. I cannot leave the hawk alone. I have to kill the hawk. And yet I'm acting out of a false humanizing of the natural world. And yet, you see, it's a dramatized dilemma. And so the line that opens the second part of it, which is where he picks the poem back up and continues what he thought he'd originally finished, is I think an anguished moment in the poem. It's not an assurance. It's I'd sooner, but I had to.
Right. This isn't a misanthropic comment at all. It's quite the opposite. It's agonizing over the obligation he feels to do what the wild god of the world would never do.
Right.
And show mercy. Yeah.
Right.
See, I mean, this is part of what I mean. I get new things out of poems that I've read 100 times.
We all do. Yeah. That's why we read them.
Well, sure. This also ties into something. One sec. Where's the Zoom chat? I saw a question that I thought was relevant to this. Mm-hmm. Vicky says, I haven't read much of Jeffers, but the beauty of things, as he refers to in Granddaughter, is another of his poems. This mm-hmm. seems to be a theme. Hawks too. Yes. Hurt Hawks is maybe one of those poems that is deeper than it first appears. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, as we just discussed. But the beauty of things is something that does come up so often. I think of, is it Flight of Swans? Mm-hmm. Is that right? Where he talks about, God, which, I mean, talking about what God means in Jeffers is a huge question. But God, doesn't have to add beauty to everything, but it's part of how we know our God, something like that.
Yeah, and there's another angle on this that can take us back to Shine Perishing Republic if we want to, and that is the connection or the equation of beauty to nature. Mm-hmm. So it's not fully recognized how critical Wordsworth was for Jeffers. So in the introduction to the 1935 edition of Ron Stallion, Tamar, and Other Poems in the Modern Library, he talks about how in 1914, while his more advanced contemporaries, as he calls them, and it implies that that's Pound and Eliot, where he says busily imitating each other, which is a wonderfully snarky comment. He says he was still imitating dead men. And then he specifies as the dead men, Milton and Shelley. And you look at Jeffers' Prentice work, and yes, you can see the Milton and the Shelley there. But what he actually wrote in the original draft of the introduction was Wordsworth. Oh. I was imitating Wordsworth. And then in pencil, he aggressively crosses that out and then politely writes Milton and Shelley above it. And there's a copy of the Californians collection that he gave to a friend where he inscribes it, might not these poems be considered first impressions of the California coast under Wordsworthian auspices? If you look at the introduction to the 1938 selected that you have there with you in Wyoming, and you think preface to the lyrical ballads, you can hear the echoes. So
I can a little bit. I always feel like, and I feel like this is something that could offend some of my fellow Jeffers fans, but I feel like you read something like Whitman's The Dreamers, and you can see some Whitman.
Oh yeah.
There, I don't feel like he ever acknowledges that.
No, he does. He was very careful not to advertise Whitman, but there are some very early unpublished poems where you can see Whitman more to the surface than you do later on. There are notes and marginal comments where he emphasizes Emerson and Poe. And again, he doesn't advertise those particularly either. But I put in the very first poem here in the group I gave you is Metempsychosis, which is an unpublished poem from 1919, before he really fully got things logicked out in terms of how his line was going to work and how the relationship to nature was going to work. And you can see this as kind of an inverted Emerson, where instead of transcending into the transparent eyeball, you emerge or immerse into and become one with the landscape in a way that's like Poe without the Gothic horror. And you can look at the Alma Venus manuscripts, which lead to the Women at Point Sur, and there are various workings there where you can see him trying to figure out, how do I create, how do I find the point of intersection between Poe and Emerson? And then in Hungerfield, some of the early drafts, one of the early drafts, he invokes the fall of the House of Usher.
I'm
So
surprised to think of Poe and Jeffers in the same breath. I never thought of a connection between them. Emerson, sure.
Yeah, well, and it startled me too. I wouldn't have thought of it if it hadn't been for those things in the manuscripts. But anyway, the question, or the problem for him here, is that in Wordsworth, you stand apart from nature and you regard it, and nature is beautiful, and and you try to understand its lessons. That works for him up to about 1920, where we get a pivot, and suddenly nature stops being a field to regard, and nature starts becoming the ground of being in which we participate. And so then beauty has to be repositioned in terms of that. So we see him here in a kind of in Metempsychosis, in a sort of transitional moment, starting to align physically with the natural world, but not yet fully working through the implications of that for how we regard nature and how we regard it through consciousness, which we see in something like salmon fishing. But I think this is a remarkably revealing moment in Jeffers, which is, I'm sure, why he didn't publish it. Coast range creeks, veins of the body of mine that will not die, when this spirit is nothing and this flesh new dirt, and the eager eye sucked its last and is drunk with darkness, I am content, I think, to cease. I rejoice no death will drag you peaks and slopes down to that peace. Neither failure of the blood will make you faint, nor its fevers choke. Canyon creeks that are my arteries, hair of forest and body of rock. If long hence and after 1,000 long millenniums you go down, I will go, the last of me then, and the endless dance of suns go on. Therefore I turn from the high lamps and limited to low hills, my love. Sweet, you are immortality enough, identity enough.
And in a very different style, although a similar voice, you can find similar thoughts in the Inhumanist, the double axe.
Right. So we come back to this eventually in the Inhumanist. Yeah. But in kind of coming back to Shine Perishing Republic, that poem was written along with the other shorter poems in Tamar and Other Poems. It was published in 1924. And in 1923, when he first constructs the Tamar collection, it's there. It's not there when he publishes the collection. He takes it out. He omits it. And then he later adds it in when he expands the volume as Roan Stallion, Tamar, and Other Poems. The question is why? Why would he take it out? He had to know it was a good poem. And I think the answer is in part because it's too political.
Sure.
So when he first puts Tamar together in 1923, it includes a number of other poems from 1918 and 1919, where he's agonizing over World War I. And that essentially casts the narrative poem Tamar as a response to World War I. The violence in that poem is a continuation of the war's violence. By the time he publishes it in 1924, he wants to emphasize the way in which violence is an aspect of nature, not an aspect of politics. So he pulls out the beginning of decadence. He pulls out Shine Perishing Republic. He pulls out some other poems which he never publishes. And the only World War I related poems that he leaves in are poems like The Truce and the Peace, where he seems to be aloof from the pain of the war.
Which are also much less memorable, really.
Which are much less memorable. And were, as he originally wrote them, much more a document of his response to the war. But by the time he publishes them, he's radically recast those sonnets and entirely changed the implications in their tone.
Vicky had a really interesting question related to this.
Yeah.
Poems like Rearmament and Finland is Down might be read as political, although that seems like a superficial interpretation. Can you comment on that?
They are political. They're an attempt to cope with the political. They're an attempt to find a way to integrate the political into his sense of nature as redemptive and a source of meaning or being. So as we start moving into toward World War II, in the poems in Be Angry at the Sun, and especially the poems in the Double Axe volume, he is actually experiencing a pretty extreme episode of not just oppression, but despair, because the world is falling apart. It's recurring. It's going back to the violence of World War I. And the vision he has of nature that he thought allowed him to cope with that is not proving adequate. You don't see that in the volumes as published. You see that in the volumes as they're first constructed. So if we look at the Double Axe, one of the early configurations of it, he takes all of the short poems and he organizes them chronologically, and he titles that section Mornings in Hell. So these are the poems that record my collapse of vision. These are the poems of my despair.
Poems like Original Sin, Cassandra, The Eye.
Yeah. So they're a chronological record of that confrontation. And then the poem, The Love and the Hate, of course, takes that to an extreme pitch, especially in the endings, which he discarded. So the endings in the draft of that poem are incredibly more horrific than the one he actually published.
It's horrific enough.
What?
It's horrific enough.
Yeah, it's horrific enough. It's like, whoa. It's like, dude, I actually thought, do I actually want to include these in the edition? But then he goes on and he writes The Inhumanist, which he then pairs, of course, with The Love and the Hate as the title poem, the Double Axe, where we get a recovery of his equilibrium. He then goes back and he reorganizes those shorter poems so that they end up being more an argument for here's the temptation to despair and here's how we avoid despair, not here's the record of my despair. Mm-hmm. So we move from the poems as more of a biographical record in their chronology to more of ideological is too strong, but more of a doctrinaire construction in the volume as it's actually published.
A little bit more prescriptive than descriptive.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, probably his strongest, most memorable statements, regardless of where in the political continuum they are, very political or not very political seeming. I think he's probably at his most memorable, at his most descriptive. Shine Perishing Republic, of course, has one of his most memorable prescriptive lines.
Right.
Right. I am looking for it right now. Be in nothing so moderate as in love of man.
Right.
But I think it's probably most memorable in its actual descriptiveness. Maybe you give us a reading of this. I'd be interested to hear how you read it.
You mean recite it?
Yeah, Shine Perishing Republic.
Sure. And by the way, this might be of interest if you really are intrigued with this poem. In the collection as he first constructed it, that is Tamar as he first put it together, this poem immediately follows a poem responding to the Versailles Peace Treaty called The Beginning of Decadence. And they make a very interesting contrast. While this America settles in the mold of its vulgarity, heavily thickening to empire, and protest, only a bubble in the molten mass, pops and sighs out, and the mass hardens, I, sadly smiling, remember that the flower fades to make fruit, the fruit rots to make earth, out of the mother and through the spring exultances, ripeness and decadence, and home to the mother. You making haste on decay, not blameworthy. Life is good, be it stubbornly long or suddenly a mortal splendor. Meteors are not needed less than mountains. Shine, perishing republic. But for my children, I would have them keep their distance from the thickening center. Corruption never has been compulsory. When the cities lie at the monster's feet, there are left the mountains. And boys, be in nothing so moderate as in love of man, a clever servant, insufferable master. There is the trap that catches noblest spirits that caught, they say, God when he walked on earth.
Which I think that the concluding line there is the most memorable and startling of the whole poem.
Yeah.
In its way, you could read it as a little bit arrogant, in as much as he's saying, well, I've been caught in the trap that got caught. But what actually this has come up a couple times, so let me just throw it out there and see what you would say, because I think that it's such a fascinating question. What does Jeffers mean when he talks about God? Because it's a word that he uses often, just about never in a way that I think anybody else means it.
Well, and it's probably also the case that he means it in slightly different ways in different poems. So in this particular instance, if it's the God who walked on the earth, then it's the Christian Savior of Jesus. There are other times when it is the totality of natural process that we can align with or not align with. I think the closest he comes to maybe giving it a foundational articulation might be in Continent's End, which is the poem that you might find this interesting. He wrote immediately before starting to write the narrative Tamar. And then he also uses it as the poem to conclude the Tamar volume. And in that one, he says something to the effect of that, let's see, actually, I'll try to paraphrase it. The gist of it is that he says that there are tides, the tides of the ocean are equated with the tides of fire that are older than the tides of the ocean. And then there is also the eye that watched. So we have, in a sense, an ultimate image of natural process, the tides of fire, but also an ultimate image of transcendence, the eye that can watch the tide of fire. And the divine God, and if you want to put it that way, I think for Jeffers, is the tide of fire being able to transcend and watch itself. It can be both the eye EYE and the suffering, experiencing, participating being within the tide of fire. The dilemma for Jeffers as a poet is that he can envision this or imagine this, but he can't achieve it. You cannot be fully immersed in being and fully transcending and aware of being. They're alternates. You can approach it. It's kind of like nuclear fusion. You can get there for that, just that little bit of instant. And the poems keep trying to do that. That's why I think you have the narratives, because the narratives give him enough momentum and amplitude and process to where you can get to something like that. And I don't think in that sense that it's accidental that the ending of Tamar is that conflagration followed by that momentary serenity of the envisioning eye. Or that's the same moment in a very different form that you get at the end of The Love and the Hate. And that's also why I think you get the moments in the shorter poems where he's in effect trying to comment on that, because in the shorter poems he can articulate the problem, but he cannot resolve it. And one of the poems where this is, I think, clearest is actually Salmon Fishing, if you look at the 4 successive drafts of the poem. Because in the first draft, probably written about December 1920, it's essentially Jeffers regarding nature almost in a Wordsworthian manner as an outsider. As the poem progresses, he starts to place himself implicitly within the poem and nature's process, and yet also standing aside as almost like a witness to it. So participating yet witnessing. And it's not overt in the poem. It's there, but it's not something that he comments directly on, but it's implicitly there, and especially evident if you see it in terms of the evolution of the piece. I don't know if that helps at all, but I think that's the central dilemma, is how do you have this visionary oneness with nature, which would be becoming one with God in an almost kind of Emersonian moment, but in a very counter-Emersonian moment, have that still be fully an embodiment in which you are part of the materiality of natural process, which is your own eventual decay and death. So Emerson finesses that through the transcendental eyeball. Jeffers won't go there.
Right. I think it's probably best comes up or most clearly comes up in the Caged Eagle's Death Dream and Cawdor.
Yeah.
But also at the Birth of an Age.
Right.
With the hanged god.
Yeah.
Odin or Prometheus or Christ, depending on which line you're reading in that.
Yeah. And I think in terms of that, it's no surprise that one of the 2 passages out of the Cawdor narrative that he places in the 1938 selected is the Caged Eagle's Death Dream. And that's one of the most lyric moments in his poetry. And in fact, the most lyric moments in his poetry occur within the narratives, not within the short poems.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking at that poem right now in the selected right here. Yeah. I mean, I could read just a little bit of it just to give people a sense of what I'm talking about here. This is toward the end of the eagle's death. I read this in a fairly different rhythm than you, which I think is interesting. It saw, according to the sight of its kind, the archetype body of life, a beaked carnivorous desire, self-upheld on storm-broad wings, but the eyes were spouts of blood, the eyes were gashed out. Dark blood ran from the ruinous eye pits to the hook of the beak and rained on the waste spaces of empty heaven. Yet the great life continued, yet the great life was beautiful, and she drank her defeat and devoured her famine for food. With extra alliteration giving us, again, a sort of Norse-like poetic structure.
Yeah.
And of course that continues and is preceded by much of similar moment. This god that is both sufferer and well, both patient and observer is a and agent is a fascinating part of his conception of the natural world.
And it's there in the poem Prelude, which leads into The Women at Point Sur,
probably
where we have the crucified hawk.
Probably his most neglected work altogether,
and one of the key ones. Not, I mean, the Prelude, I think, is one of the ultimate pieces of his canon.
I think that is in. Maybe it's in this.
It's not in the 1938 selected.
Yeah, there's just like one page just about from The Women of Point Sur that he cites here, which he himself seemed to kind of give up on it. Well, nobody appreciated this.
Right. Yeah. In the work, the series of poems that he attempted leading up to Point Sur, there's some very interesting notes to himself as he's trying to figure out how to move this thing forward. In one of them, he says basically what he wants is ode. He wants the narrative to become an ode praising God. So the narrative not as story, the narrative as poem of praise, as lyric.
Which may be part of why it is so often found to be a difficult narrative to appreciate or understand. And so speaking of which, part of our unifying theme in this discussion and the poems that you selected here were, as we mentioned earlier, the language is normal 20th century English, but the message underneath can be so difficult to get at. And one poem that came to my mind when we were having this discussion before this Zoom discussion was Red Mountain, which I have often brought up because it's his Colorado poem.
Sure.
I'm always trying to get people into Robinson Jeffers, and so I've read this to numerous different people saying, "Well, look at this. This is from the San Juans, right?" And I cannot tell you what percentage of times, it's probably 98% that I've read this to someone and the response has been, huh? Right? What is this? What is he talking about here? Would you perhaps recite this for us and then give us your take on what is going on beneath the surface of what looks like otherwise fairly plain language?
I will try. And I will confess to you, Jackson, that this is not a poem that I've worked deeply with.
That's great. I mean, actually, if nothing else, that may be better for demonstrating our point here. I mean, we can agree on what it says and what the words mean, but what does it mean?
Well, when I was still teaching, and I'd teach poetry, I would tell students they were not allowed to talk about what anything meant. They were only allowed to talk about what it did, how it worked.
Oh, I like that.
They would get very upset with me. But it's we well, I'm
only your student. I'm only your student in the most extended meaning of that term. But all right, what does it do?
Yeah, well, we'll see here. Okay, we'll try. And if I pitch off the high wire and I'm going splat, you're going to have to take over. Beyond the Sierras and sagebrush, Nevada ranges and vast vulture utopias of Utah desert, the mountain we admired last year on our summer journey, the same rose-red pyramid glows over Silverton. Whoever takes the rock pass from Ouray sees foaming waterfalls and trees like green flames, like the rocks flaming green and above, up the wild gorge, up the wild sky, incredibly blood color around the snow spot, the violent peak. We thought it was too theatrical to last. But if we shipped to Cape Horn or were buying camels in Urga, Red Mountain would not turn pale for our absence. We like the dark skies and lead color heights, but the excellence of things is really unscrupulous. It will dare anything.
Wonderfully read. I will point out so that I don't get savaged by Colorado viewers in the comments. It is Uray.
You're right. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
That's just,
I don't know your or Colorado mountains as well as you do.
oh, it's a town or
Oh,
name
okay.
name for a Ute chief.
Okay. Well, then I'm doubly splat on my face. Thank you. Uh,
No, I'm covering myself because it's always those little things that generate 30 comments.
yeah, the internet is a wonderful wonderful world. I mean, to in part, this is Jeffers being playful, but also being serious.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think he gives us that cue with the word theatrical, which is a very unusual word for him, and as is unscrupulous. And then we get that last little twist. It will dare anything, which is really nice. You know the poem Joy, a much earlier poem. There's an earlier kind of twist ending like that to that poem that he discarded, which I regret he discarded. I mean, I think what he's doing here is registering first an intensity of seeing the landscape, trees like green flames, rocks flaming green. So we set aside the normal this is the world and now let's describe what's there to this is perception. What are the metaphors that it drives? So we don't normally think of trees like green flames, but they can look like green flames. That's how it's registering on his eye. And in a sense, in that way, both the landscape itself, but also his reaction to it is overly theatrical. And then he recognizes, wait a minute, it's its own thing, whatever our reaction is to it. That's a different beauty. It's teaching me that different beauty. Oh, wow, nature, I will never encompass it because it will dare anything, and I cannot achieve that. It outstrips me.
Mm-hmm.
Let me play with that. I don't know. It just, again, I read this more as an engagement and a reaction.
I think you're exactly right. Not that you need me to tell you that, but a couple of the thoughts that occur to me in reading it is that this is in conversation with some of his other poems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of them is even the Caged Eagle's Death Dream, which maybe I see just because I feel like I wake and I sleep on this poem. But there's the moment where as the eagle continues, or the eagle spirit continues to soar, he sees more and more
Mm-hmm.
of the world beneath him. And I feel like this is even a chapter perhaps in the eagle as we open this, because of course the eagle doesn't look any further than the Sierras in that poem, at least looking eastward toward the American continent. This
Right.
is going further. This is perhaps
Mm-hmm.
what the eagle might have seen beyond the Sierras and the sagebrush Nevada ranges, because of course he can't see all these things in his human perspective on the $1 Million Highway, which is where this is set.
Mm-hmm.
He can only see these sites in Colorado. Another thing that I think is really interesting is this interplay between unscrupulous and theatrical.
Yeah.
Right, there's a little bit of a is he casting? It's there's almost a little bit of aspersion cast on theatricality there.
Yeah.
That but the excellence of things dares to be theatrical, which could be unscrupulous, perhaps in a person.
Right. Yeah. Nature is beyond being theatrical or scrupulous or unscrupulous. It is.
Mm-hmm.
But we may react in that way. So again, that problematizes or complicates the human relationship to the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think you see that. I mean, I think there's a little bit of conversation there with a poem like Return,
Mm-hmm.
where part of what which I think is one of his most most excellent poems, where he wants to get away from the thoughts in his head and touch just the physical. Right. I will find my accounting where the alder leaf quivers. Right.
Yeah.
I will touch things and no more thoughts.
Right.
But in a poem like this, he can't help but attach thoughts to what he's observing.
Right. Well, because you can't erase consciousness.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the other term here that we've danced around a little bit. What is it that keeps us from participating fully in nature on its own terms? It's the very thing that allows us to see nature, but it's also then the thing which sets us in some way apart from nature, which is consciousness. It's our blessing and our curse.
And of course, he takes a view in some poems of nature itself as having a sort of consciousness. There's a poem in the beginning and end. It may actually be the one called The Beginning and the End, where he talks about the snake in its egg, or the bird in its egg, or the earth long before the great whales, but all of these things being already in prospect.
Yeah. Now I'm going to be the pedantic editor there and offer a comment. Melba Bennett invented that title after he died, when she chose to publish that poem. It's an untitled manuscript.
Well, I should be more sensitive to these things. Well, what's interesting is that some of the same editorial detritus has accumulated in a few decades around a fairly obscure American poet that's collected around, the Eddas, right, for 800 years, right? I mean, I wind up having these discussions with people all the time. You are reading into a poem something that's in the prose part of a manuscript that frames that poem, that was written hundreds of years after that poem was composed, right? And we have to keep in mind all of these editorial layers that are there, and there's a surprising amount of that even with Jeffers. It sounds like a lot of it is him editing himself, right? I'd love to see the twist ending to Joy. Is that in your collected poetry?
Yeah, that stuff is all in volume 5.
Okay.
I'll send you the entry.
Well, I have volume 2 of your collected poetry, because it has it. I decided to get one volume, and that one had the most of what I wanted.
There you go. Well, that's the way you should do it. I keep trying to get Stanford to redo that whole collection as an electronic archive, so that it would all be machine searchable. And wonderful. They don't see the point, which is depressing.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that the environmental awareness has brought back some awareness of Jeffers as a sort of, he's really not an environmentalist, but a proto-environmentalist.
Right.
I don't know, a conservationist of an old type. But he's so obscure now. I mean, I don't think I have ever met anyone that I have brought up Jeffers to who knew who Jeffers was beforehand. This is always someone I'm introducing completely ab novo to people.
Right. And yet, and this is the thing that I keep trying to figure out. That selected poetry that Stanford did has sold well over 2,000 copies, which for a book of poetry in this era is a mega seller.
I wouldn't know what would be good or bad.
200 copies. 200 copies.
Good. Is that the baseline? Okay, well, then that's blowing it out of the water.
Right. So, unless you think of poets like Eliot, Pound, Stevens, H.D., maybe Marianne Moore, perhaps, of that era, who are routinely taught over and over and over again in survey classes, Jeffers has an unusually broad readership. And it's not just, it's a handful of academics, which is what I think, Jackson, you and I are aware of. And yet, let's see, when volume one of the collected came out, I had a woman call me up one afternoon and she said, "Can I bring this copy by? I want you to inscribe it for my husband. It's a gift." And I said, "Well, okay, but these are not my poems." And she said, "Well, he's a long haul truck driver, and I think he loves Jeffers, and I want him to have this book." Okay, well, how many long haul truck drivers are cruising the interstate, going back and forth across the country with the cantos?
And would Pound want them to? Whereas I think Jeffers would appreciate it.
Right. So it's a mixed, conflicted landscape, and I don't know how we deal with that other than to try to keep the conversation at least somewhat alive. And in my mind, part of what is necessary for that is to counter where I can the view that you understand Jeffers just by cherry picking a few seemingly didactic pronouncements, and posting them on a calendar, like kill men, don't kill hawks, or something, because that doesn't allow the poems to be poems. And I'm convinced, and I'm old enough that it doesn't matter, that when that truck driver is driving, he may think that what matters is that claim, but the reason that claim is registering with him is because he's responding to something more organic and fully there in the poem. He may not be tracking it, but he's responding to it, because otherwise those statements wouldn't matter.
I agree. I think that may even be something similar on a meta level between Whitman's work and Jeffers' work.
Mm-hmm.
I think so often you encounter Whitman in these little tiny quotations that don't have their true meaning or force.
Right. Or their full force.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the lines from To You, for example, come to mind, or Frost, actually, a little bit, can get quoted just, lines out of context. I mean, how many times have we seen that line from the Road Less Traveled,
right,
quoted out of context, whereas it lacks the kind of elegiac tone without the whole poem.
Yeah. Do you know Randall Jarrell's article on Frost called "The Two Frosts"? I think it was done sometime in maybe the mid 1950s, and basically he says, well, there's two Frosts. There's the Frost that people put on their coffee table and quote from, and then there's the poet. And one is the homespun New Englander dispensing wisdom, and the other is the darker Frost, is I think the way he puts it, has the more complex engagement with the world. And I have a sense that Jeffers is very much like Frost in that sense. There are two Frosts. Or two Jeffers. There's the Jeffers we engage as if he's dispensing wisdom, as if he's the California prophet looking out from the coast. And then there's the Jeffers, who is the richer poet, who we are still actually learning to read.
That's really well put. I'm still learning to read him. I mean, I've been reading Jeffers since 2012 is when I discovered him.
Huh.
And I still find new things every year, not just new things to read, although I've tracked down most things that are squirreled away in one volume or another. But even the really obscure stuff like the Californians, but just finding new angles and corners, just as I did just a little bit earlier when you were reading Hurt Hawks.
Mm-hmm.
I think this has been a great discussion. I've learned quite a bit myself. We have one more poem in the document that you shared. Would you perhaps recite that as a way to bring this home, maybe with a couple comments on it? That was Vulture.
Oh, Vulture.
Which, by the way, the person I learned of Jeffers from is Edward Abbey.
Okay, right.
He completely rips off this poem.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm talking about? In Desert Solitaire, he has this.
I don't know the passage, but I'm aware of Abbey's interest in Jeffers. Yeah.
So he completely rips this off, like takes this poem, turns it into his own prose paragraphs. I mean, like if you've read Jeffers, you know exactly what he's doing, but
Uh-huh.
he does not acknowledge it, which I've always thought was kind of funny.
Right. Okay. Well, just as a kind of a two bits, kind of leading into this. This was written actually at a time when Jeffers was still well enough that death wasn't quite as imminent as he suggests in the poem. And I think this is one where there is a kind of playful self dramatizing. And the last, I guess, little bit, I don't know if you know the poet William Stafford. But Stafford loved Jeffers, and I heard Stafford read this at a Jeffers Centennial program. Stafford at that point was in his mid-70s and looked like he was 95, very craggy, and he read it playing up as if he were old and decrepit, which he was actually very, very hale and hearty. And I thought it was a wonderful bit of theater on Stafford's part, which kind of matched Jeffers' own theater here. I had walked since dawn and lay down to rest on a bare hillside above the ocean. I saw through half-shut eyelids a vulture wheeling high up in heaven, and presently it passed again, but lower and nearer, its orbit narrowing. I understood then that I was under inspection. I lay death still and heard the flight feathers whistle above me and make their circling come nearer. I could see the naked red head between the great wings, beak downward staring. I said, "My dear bird, we are wasting time here. These old bones will still work. They are not for you." But how beautiful he'd looked gliding down on those great sails. How beautiful he looked veering away in the sea light over the precipice. I tell you solemnly that I was sorry to have disappointed him, to be eaten by that beak and become part of him, to share those wings and those eyes. What a sublime end of one's body. What an enskyment. What a life after death. So there's a moment of imagining becoming one with nature's process and having the ability to be the eye that watched by becoming an alternate eye that's watching, that is through the hawk's eye or the vulture's eye. So it brings us in a way sort of full circle, and I guess you could almost say it's the flip side of the same coin as metempsychosis.
Mm-hmm. 5 decades later, or 4?
4 at least, yeah. Well, see, 1919, yeah, 4. Yeah.
And for those interested in Scandinavian connection, by the way,
yes,
2 of Jeffers's translators, Olaf Hauge and in Norway, and Torkild Bjørnvig in Denmark, have interesting takes on a similar theme to this poem in their own work. Bjørnvig in Epimetheus, that volume, and Olaf Hauge in Jangelstro have poems that I think are kind of in conversation with this one. Were you thinking of something else?
I'd love, for one thing, I'd love to get the references for those poems that you just mentioned. And also there is another poem of Jeffers that he did not publish that's called Vulture, which has specific Scandinavian references. I'll send you the text of that.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I'd love to see an unpublished poem. And you yourself, I'd like to point out, if it's not too much, are a poet. Is your own work in conversation with, influenced by Jeffers? Where do you situate yourself in relation to him?
I think inevitably I'm influenced by Jeffers, but I'm a little more interested or engaged with kind of social dynamics, social histories than Jeffers would be. that's a hard thing to answer in the abstract. There are certain poems where Jeffers is very much a part of the dialogue.
I feel like in my own work, original and translated, if you know Jeffers, you can see him in what I write. You know, as a not saying I'm not saying that to compliment myself. I'm saying that like you can tell I've read Jeffers from just the way that I phrase certain things, or just my use of that stress time line.
Well, there's that, and then there's also at times in various people's work who are impacted by Jeffers. And I'm thinking, for example, of Betty Adcock, a really wonderful poet from North Carolina. On the surface, you're not going to think Jeffers when you read Betty, but there's an underlying logic of the relationship of the self to the natural world in Betty's work that is informed by her deep commitment to Jeffers as a poetic figure. So it's Jeffers' impact in contemporary poetry is wider, I think, than people realize, and it's not usually in overt ways that you would say, "Oh, there's Jeffers." It's there's a stance, or there's a logic about the self and being, or something that draws on a perspective out of Jeffers rather than out of some of the other modernists.
That makes perfect sense. I think I think I always have this almost guilty feeling that someone is going to look at something that I wrote, or even translated from Old Norse, and say, "Aha, you're just trying to be Robinson Jeffers." But I'd like to look at Betty's work. That sounds worth worth appreciating. Someone who's got some kind of spiritual influence without the same style. I feel like
I'm not thinking of the titles offhand, but I'll pull her collections out and see if I can identify a couple of poems that might be ones to start with.
All right. Well, I will happily do so. Well,
so I need to send you Betty, and I need to send you Vulture, the other Vulture.
Yeah.
And you're going to send me the references for those other two poems.
Bjornvik and Hauge.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, if any of the people who were here today want to follow up on anything, they're more than welcome to contact me directly.
Well, thank you very much for that generous offer. And thank you very much for taking the time. I had a thoroughly educational time here. I mean, I learned quite a bit about someone I thought I knew a lot about.
I appreciate the chance.
I really hope that people who have watched this will take the time to read some Jeffers. Early on, you suggested the 2002 selected poetry volume, which is available on Kindle for anyone who wants to just pick something up like that.
Did they be careful? Does the Kindle preserve the line breaks?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Yep. That is how I first read it, in fact. So I know it's fine.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody who came. Thank you, Patreon, for your support. And for now, I wish everybody all the best.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And thanks for having me.
Of course. My pleasure. All right. All the best, everyone.